Hi individuals, I'm Birdie Ray. Under what circumstances can you not help shouting, climate change? For me, I live in a city that is famous for its dryness, but in 2021, it is unusually raining. On another occasion, I visited a city that is supposed to have 4 distinct seasons. It was January, and I felt too hot to buy short sleeves at mall. Does these experiences make you want to do something about climate change? The flat Maldives and the aliens of small island states and the Inuit tribes living on ice fought to make their sufferings visible to the world. As individuals living in what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change considers to be the most vulnerable areas to climate change, they are facing a crisis that is significantly more severe. In this episode, I will explore with you how difficult the process of acknowledging that climate change has negative impacts on human rights has been. Whether or not this awakens a sense of crisis in anyone, it is important that we at least know what kind of crisis we are facing. We start by looking at the Republic of Maldives, a country considered to be the flattest in the world. Among the 26 major atolls and 1,190 small islands that comprise this country, the highest position is only 1.5 meters above the sea level. Most Maldives live within 100 meters of the coastline. On December 26, 2004, a powerful 9.3 magnitude earthquake and tsunami struck the waters of the Indonesian island of Sumatra. The tsunami caused tidal waves of up to 30 meters, and even the Maldives, 3,000 kilometers away, was not spared from this terrible disaster. Lives and homes of the Maldivian people were severely damaged. According to statistics, 82 people died in the disaster. 40% of the land was submerged, and 15,000 people had their homes destroyed. In fact, the Maldivian government had long been concerned about the potential negative impact of sea level rise on it. As far back as 1987, its national representatives began to raise their voices at the United Nations in an attempt to draw international attention to the issue. In addition to the Maldives, there are many small island states around the world that face similar issues, including some developing countries in low-lying coastal areas. In 1990, at the core of the Maldives, they decided to form the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. This decision was backed by political considerations and scientific reasons. Firstly, many of the countries in the alliance are members of the United Nations and all are at a similar level of development. Together, they may present a richer illustration in demonstrating the severity of the impacts. In addition, more than 2,000 scientists have provided important evidence and data in establishing the link between climate change and sea level rise. And yes, these are not two concepts that are naturally related. Scientists believe that the phenomenon of global warming clearly reflects the fundamental problem of climate change, namely that human activity affects the way the atmosphere absorbs and releases energy, with the potential result being rising sea levels. According to the IPCC presentation in 1992, the data showed that global average sea level has risen at a rate of 1 to 2 millimeters per year over the last 100 years, and this result was expected to reach 30 to 50 centimeters by 2050. The wisdom of forming an alliance was fully demonstrated in 1992, when on May 9th, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee adopted the famous United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, stating that it could ensure that the interests of AOSIS are properly addressed by an effective convention. Next, let's draw a timeline, starting in 2005. In that year, the Inuit submitted a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to sue the U.S. government for actions and inactions that contribute to the effects of climate change, such as the failure to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. In their petition, The Inuit argued that this resulted in violation of 7 of their fundamental human rights: the right to preservation of health, rights to life and security, rights to the benefits of culture, rights to use and enjoy personal property, rights to own and utilize traditional land, rights to resident, movement, and the inviolability of the home, rights to subsistence. Why do they bring this up? Let me explain in detail. First and foremost, the greatest disaster to the livelihood of the Inuit was the melting of the ice sheet caused by rising temperatures. The thinning of the ice made it difficult for the Inuit to obtain food through hunting and fishing. As the weather warmed up, the spread of disease from past or spoiled food became more severe. For indigenous people, the way they produce knowledge is different from the work of scientists. Over the past so many years, Inuit tribal leaders and hunters have accumulated knowledge of ocean currents, wind, and ice during their hunting activities. They used this to predict ocean, ice, and weather conditions. However, as climate change accelerates, the natural environment became increasingly unpredictable. This knowledge, accumulated over long years of indigenous lives, became to be less useful, and its cultural conservation value inevitably diminished. In addition to this, the Inuit would have been able to generate income from tourism. But with melting of the snow and ice, the related activities cannot continue. And there are still some other terrible extreme weathers, like landslides, sea erosion, and ocean storm. As these disasters destroy their homes and infrastructure, their living space shrank. The shock faced by the Inuit tribe was sharp and heartbreaking, but the Inter-American Commission considered it insufficient to determine whether the actions and inactions of the U.S. government violated the rights to protection mentioned in the American Declaration of November 16, 2006. Receiving this response, Sheila Walter-Cloutier, the president of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, together with the Earth Justice and the Center for International Environmental Law, requested a hearing to discuss the link between climate change and human rights and requested more information about the decision. The Commission agreed to this request. However, on March 1, 2007, they were only given a hearing without the testimony of the U.S. representative. Thus, this meeting, which seemed to have no intention of achieving any concrete result from the beginning, also ended without any surprising results. Although the Inuit's effort on the petition failed to produce any direct benefits for the Inuit, it succeeded in sparking a series of subsequent related studies and complaints, including those involving the Maldives and AOSIS. Like a stone, the case was thrown into the water, causing ripples of discussion and research around the world. In November of the same year, an AOSIS conference led by the Maldives decided to introduce the impact of climate change on human rights in subsequent negotiations on the climate agreement. The alliance decided to adopt the Malay Declaration on the Human Dimension of Global Climate Change. This was the first intergovernmental declaration to acknowledge specifically that climate change has clear and immediate implications for the full enjoyment of human rights, which include the rights to life, to an adequate standard of living, and to the highest attainable standard of health. The aim is precisely to develop a clear strategy that can bridge climate change with human rights. With the effort of 78 co-sponsors, AOSIS also made a call to professional teams seeking cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, on the topic Maldives' National Adaptation to Climate Change, the Human Dimension of Global Climate Change. The representative of the Ministry of Environment, Energy and Water Resources of the Maldives addressed the European Parliament Temporary Committee on Climate Change in Brussels on 26 March 2008. This speech explained the declaration and sought a positive approach to climate change adaptation from now to the future from a humanitarian care perspective. At the same time, the Maldives also provided an 85-page contribution to the OHCHR for their study on the relationship between climate change and human rights. The contribution explained which human rights are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and which should be safeguarded in mitigation and adaptation actions to address climate change. The Maldives suggest that greenhouse gas emitters from abroad create environmental problems and force them to respond. Without controls to reduce or at least stabilize emissions, any subsequent remedies will be ineffective. The country had already taken measures such as reclaiming land, creating artificial islands, and resetting citizens to avoid damage. This included the construction of an artificial island between 1997 and 2002 by the Maldives, together with a Belgian joint venture and consultants from Singapore, using Japanese funding and Dutch reclamation technology. For those projects, the Maldives argued that it should not be the victims who really had to take responsibility and pay the high cost. Following the contribution, the OHCHR report has focused on the International Bill of Human Rights as well as the UN Declaration of Human Rights, to show that these elements proposed by AOSIS are indeed recognized and protected by numerous international human rights treaties. The international community should therefore have a corresponding moral obligation to the rights threatened by climate change. The OHCHR report marks the first attempt by a UN human rights body to provide a comprehensive assessment of the complex relationship and linkages between climate change, environmental degradation, and human rights. The comprehensiveness and authority of the assessment was endorsed by written and oral submissions from over 30 countries, 35 international organizations, national human rights institutions, non-governmental organizations, and academic institutions. After all this work, there is finally an influential report that confirms the potential impact of global warming on all human rights, and the rights to life, adequate food, water, health, adequate housing, and self-determination will be most directly affected. On 20th of March 2009, following the release of the report, the Human Rights Council adopted a second resolution to address climate change and human rights. The resolution states that human rights obligations and commitments have the potential to inform and strengthen international and national policy making in area of climate change, promoting policy coherence, legitimacy, and sustainable outcomes. So far, the argument that climate change and global warming in particular will have a negative impact on human rights has been established as a consensus and even agreed as a fact. The related story ends here for now. On climate change, a sustained series of efforts on awareness and action are still urgently needed. At the end of today's video, I would like to quote Sheila Walter-Cloutier from the 2005 meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Everything that is happening affects almost every aspect of the life of the Inuit. We are on such a piece of land, people, with ice and snow and animals. Our hunting culture thrives because of the cold. We need the cold to keep our culture and way of life. Climate change has become the ultimate threat to the Inuit culture. How would you respond if an international assessment prepared by more than 300 scientists from 15 countries concluded that your age-old culture and economy was doomed, and that you would become a footnote to globalization?